Tim. Welcome back to Watch One, and thanks for logging on. I have to admit, it's been a while. It feels good to be back.
Sure does feel good to be back, Tim. Thanks.
Welcome back, Mike.
Thank you.
This is my good friend Mike Michaels, and I'm making a point of shaking his hand because it's tough to follow up a week of dead air. We're going to do our best, guys. Tonight, Federico is talking watches in the live chat box. I've got a live studio audience of Jesse, our friend Alfred. Raph is manning the switcher. Of course, Fed, typing away, so if you've got questions, he can field them. We're going to get to yours, though. All the same, two great ways to experience watches. Mike Michaels on Instagram. Mm-hmm. What is your tag?
Michael R. Michaels.
Great stuff, guys. Watches in pieces. You know you like it. Also, tonight, we've got a Back with a Bang special. The Zenith El Primero versus the world. New movements, old movements, high horology, base movements. It's Godzilla Final Wars with watches. And, if you like the short format, my Watch You Want Watch Reviews channel, where you can see me reviewing watches 24 hours a day. With that said, Mike, let's talk a little bit about the Zenith El Primero and why it's a standard in the industry.
It's a standard to begin with. It was the first ground-up built automatic chronograph, where everything was integrated into it. It wasn't built as a module. And as the Breitling Calibre 11 was, It was not, which is known as the first automatic chronograph. This is the first built automatic chronograph, designed and built. And actually, this is one of the first examples that we have here.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of funny.
Yeah, just, as we're talking about that, it was designed in 1969. You probably know what month it came out. And when it came out with a bang. It's a great movement. It did have some drawbacks. Had a lot lower jewel count when it first came out, which is like a lot of the chronographs, a lot of the first base movements. Nobody knew the history of this watch and what it was going to be and what it was going to mean to horology, and we'll actually get to that through the segment. How the movement almost didn't exist.
Yeah, it very nearly got axed in 1975. I want to throw a little bit more background into the El Primero. It was part of a three-way race between Seiko of Japan, which technically probably won the race, but no one remembers the 6139 debuted commercially first. Zenith, however, did a complete job engineering a movement designed to stand the test of time. Well, those old Seikos still run great, and a lot of the old modular micro-rotor Calibre 11s from the Heuer, Buren, Hamilton, Breitling consortium are still serviceable today. The best answer to the question of how to build an integrated automatic chronograph was the high-beat El Primero, and the fact is, Mike, 1969 to 1975 was Flight 1. In the 80s, as mechanical horology started coming back, surprise, surprise, the tooling still existed. How did that happen?
Well, because the tooling was supposed to be destroyed. When the quartz revolution came about, everybody said, whoever the head of Zenith at the time said,
it was Zenith Radio. Americans actually owned it.
We're not gonna produce mechanical movements anymore. The mechanical era is dead. And so they came out and they said, get rid of it. The way the story goes, the way I have read about the story is, they assigned basically one crew to basically get rid of the tooling. And instead of that, somebody thought, you know what, we can't get rid of this tooling, and they put it in storage. Years later, and you'll probably know the year.
1984.
1984. Nearly 10 years later, they came out and somebody said, it'd be really nice if we could redesign and remanufacture the El Primero, but it would be way too costly to have to re-engineer it.
Yeah.
And somebody raised their hand and said, we have it. We have the equipment.
It was all hidden in pieces around the manufacture. One of the benefits of having so many empty rooms during the ghostly era of the late 70s in Swiss watchmaking was you could hide things. The tooling was never sold for scrap. The watchmaker, actually, I believe he was an assembly line foreman, Charles Vermeaux, immortalized in many Zenith limited editions today, saved the equipment, and ultimately it went on in the late 1980s to power many other watch brand chronographs as a customer caliber for the likes of Concorde, for the likes of Abel, and most famously as the engine of the Rolex Daytona from 1988 to 1999.
The 4030.
We're going to get to the 4030 in a second. So Mike, let's talk a little bit, because the Zenith El Primero is a standard. It's not perfect. Let's go over the pluses and the minuses. In terms of the pluses, the advantages, again, it was the first totally complete answer to the question of an integrated automatic high-beat chronograph. We'll give Seiko a tie. They did make it to market first. Zenith held the first press conference. We'll fight over that forever. But it was the most enduring answer because it's tough. Potentially it's very precise. It can easily take a chronometer regulation, I believe. And with a 52-hour power reserve, they really did something spectacular given the high beat.
High beat and long power reserve. And to accomplish that, again, back in 1969 when they came up with that, usually when you go to a higher beat, because you have more movement, more teeth in the escape wheel, more escaping, that usually lowers the power reserve. So they were able to design it and gear it to the point where it actually had a higher power reserve with a faster beat. And the reason for the faster beat is you have more room for air.
Yes.
And if there's any blips, instead of a 28.8 where if you have a blip, you're going to notice it a couple seconds here or there. With a 36,000, you have more room for deviations in the timing.
Essentially how it works is it's going to be at a greater deviance from the natural frequency of motion on the wrist. So if you have a big, slow beating pocket watch balance and you're moving it around, there's a good chance you're going to hit its natural harmonic or at least overlap a little bit. Think of wave interference. And the faster you beat the watch, the less likely that it's going to meet something like a natural harmonic frequency in the course of being moved around on the wrist. That's the advantage of a high beat. It was also a very robust movement. It was suited to sports watches right from the get-go. With a column wheel, it didn't have the kind of ropiness of a cam-driven system.
It's a column wheel. It's also it's for what it was made and when it was designed. It's a thin movement. It's a lot thinner than 7750 is, and to me, it's a fantastic movement. It was designed well. There are a couple drawbacks. There are a couple flaws that, especially in the earlier ones, they had reversing wheel problems. The reversing wheel, which actually is the clutch that engages the oscillating weight to give the mainspring power, it uses actually 4 independent clicks inside that reversing wheel, light as a feather springs, to hold a sawtooth wheel, two sawtooth wheels.
Yes.
That wheel breaks. It breaks, the springs break. If one spring fractures, the other one's supposed to hold it, but the springs let go. So a lot of times doing the service on El Primeros, we have to replace that. One of the things Rolex did, they changed it. They changed, we'll get into some other things they did, but they also put their own reversing wheel system common throughout the Rolex line. And that was one of the good advantages of the 4030.
And the 4030, of course, that 1988 to 1999 Rolex Daytona movement. It operated at 28.8, not 36,000. It used conventional lubricants in the escapement, but it also did everything the Rolex way. Free sprung balance, Breguet overcoil hairspring, chronometer certified. It had a different winding system integrated. It was a very different movement. And just to dispel myths, it was built in a special room at Zenith for Rolex, not constructed by Rolex to Zenith's designs. So, essentially, the El Primero does have some disadvantages, as Mike mentioned. Mechanically, there are some issues with the winding system that can be very difficult to work on because it's high maintenance and it's very sensitive. With 4 springs, all of them very small, leaf-style springs, it's easy to lose parts and it's easy to over-lubricate. Moreover, there are some shortcomings where the movement shows its age today. It's non-hacking functionality. There's no way to stop the seconds and synchronize the watch. It uses a lateral clutch, which is lovely to look at, but it does have an awful lot of play in the seconds hand when you start the chronograph, and sometimes when you reset it as well. The early 17 jewel models are inferior.
Yes, they'll run, but they're not going to run to today's standards. One other thing I'll mention too when you talk about drawbacks, the calendar jumpers. Anyone that's worked on an El Primero knows about the calendar jumper. It's about the size of a paper clip underneath the dial, and more than half of the El Primeros that I've serviced, they've been fractured. And it's just it's a fracture of the metal. The spring doesn't break. It actually, the metal delaminates on them. And it's a very large spring. There's actually 2 jumper springs in the system, and that's one, like I said, it just looks like a paper clip inside of there. And it's just a strange looking piece.
Rolex 4030.
Yep.
No date.
No date.
There you go. So other, I would say, shortcomings of the El Primero today are the fact that in an era when advanced materials are being integrated into the watch, this is controversial. I feel like Zenith has gone with a solution that's kind of the worst of both worlds. They've incorporated non-reproducible synthetics into the escapement with the anchor and the escape wheel, but they haven't incorporated them into the hairspring. Until the new Calibre 9004 and the Dayfi 21, that's actually a carbon fiber hairspring. But up to that particular movement, it's always been a metallic hairspring with a silicon escapement.
Right. It had the standard Swiss lever escapement, jeweled escapement. Everything was the same until they started producing the newest line. And they'll produce that watch in different versions. Well, you'll have two watches. One will be chronometer spec, one won't. If it's chronometer spec, it's going to have the silicone escapement, or the silicone escape wheel and pallet, non-adjustable.
And the other thing about that is the watch can still become magnetized because the hairspring is still metallic. Again, the Day 21 might be the beginning of the solution to this problem, but up to now, it's still a weakness of the El Primero. And finally, we are talking about a relatively simple balance assembly. It's a balance cock, not very well stabilized. It's not a free-sprung index. It uses old-style regulating pins, not Edicron.
Yeah, it's standard. It's standard old school technology that you see in a lot of high horology because it takes more watchmaker effort to adjust it. Without the Edicron, you actually have to move pins. It's a different regulating system. You can still regulate them flawlessly. It's not a problem to get them within spec. It just takes a little more touch.
Now, could you speak to this, Mike? There's a myth, and maybe it's a justified myth. Maybe this is a myth that becomes legend, that becomes truth. But allegedly, lubricating the escapement of an El Primero requires special lubricants and a light touch.
It's a very light touch because of the speed. And again, you have parts moving faster than in a 28/8. We always use the same lubricant. It's just, again, you put it on, it's a lot lighter. You're going to use it lighter, and with more teeth in the escape wheel, it's going to travel. It's lightness. And again, anytime we're working on anything in finer watches, it's always the quantity of lubricants as well as where you're putting it. Too much lubrication is never a good thing. And when it's going to spray around inside of a movement because it's flying so fast, that's all the more reason not to.
Now, is it correct to say that the rumor that the El Primero wears out faster or has shorter service intervals?
I don't see it.
Okay.
I don't see it. Now, what I will say, though, is I do see on the striking 10th,
okay,
we do have amplitude losses with the chronograph running on a striking 10th. And it's a massive amplitude drop when the chronograph is engaged. I never got the direct numbers as to what they're supposed to be and what they consider okay and what the power reserve is. But when you have a striking 10th and you have it's geared totally different. Where they come off the fourth wheel to run the chronograph, it's actually a stepped wheel. That's just geared so differently.
Yeah, I know the famed star wheel.
Yep, exactly.
So, now guys, we've sort of explored the El Primero from every facet. There are many variations of it, and I think its final Achilles heel is that 30 millimeters across, it's frankly too small for many of its modern applications. But let's take a look at the competition, and I think a great one to start with is the Frédéric Piguet 1185. The 1180 family, launched in the mid-80s, it was designed from the base plate up to be a luxury watch movement. We're past the quartz crisis. It was designed specifically to go into Blancpain products. It was part of the Jean-Claude Biver resurrection of that brand. Now, Mike, I think we can say that the Piguet 1185, which finds its way into Vacherons over the years, which finds its way into Cartier and Audemars Piguet, so many different brands, because it's a high horology movement, we could say it's thin and fine, generally nicely built and finished, even in its stock forms.
Not as durable.
Exactly. There are detriments.
It is a vertical clutch. It is a vertical clutch movement, which means the chronograph wheel is actually, it's the clutch itself, where you actually have hands that come in, little arms that come in and grab it and arrest it or relax it. If it's arrested, the chronograph stops. When it relaxes, that's when the chronograph's operating.
With nothing in between. That's the key. That's why the vertical clutch is an advantage for precision, because there's not a jump, there's no play between teeth.
It's on or off.
It's like an automotive clutch. It closes and there's an instant binding. There's no take-up. It also resets more precisely. There's never the danger that you get stuck between two teeth.
Right. Exactly, because it just resets everything. No matter where it's at, it just pushes everything back to zero.
And like the El Primero, it uses a column wheel, a crenellated wheel with horns and levers for function selection, so it's crisp. It's also thin. It's a thin movement.
One thing, you mentioned the column wheel. We've been talking about that. The column wheel, when you hear that word, it's basically, it's a round wheel with fingers on it that stick up. And what that allows is the different, as the column wheel rotates, it engages or disengages by pushing levers in or out. So it either allows the levers to go in and that engages the wheels, or they pop back out, and then that's when they're running free.
I don't know if you can quite see the column wheel just underneath my finger now. Our macro cameras are not having it. Guys, the important thing to remember about a column wheel is it's more traditional. It was the original fashion of actuating a chronograph, and for the most part, from a tactile and auditory sense, it's more satisfying to operate.
It has a great feel to it too.
Let me see if I
and
can
that
help
one's
you out
actually,
there.
this one's actually blued, so you may be able to see it in there.
The bottom line is you can hear and you can feel the difference when you're using a column
So
wheel.
smooth.
Now, the disadvantages of the Frederic Piguet 1180 family, very small. The same size as an ETA 2824, 2892. It's 25.6 millimeters. It's completely unsuitable for most modern case sizes and display case
I have seen some modules put on top of it, mostly flybacks.
Yeah.
Gerald Genta and also Harry Winston. They'll put the flybacks on top of that movement. We've worked on those, serviced them, and again, that's one way. When you put the module on top, it's one way to move your registers out to the sides. You move them out further.
Now, the other thing I will show you is because I have a Blancpain L Evolution Trofeo. Great watch, great movement, but you can see on the case back that there's a fairly sizable disparity between movement size and case size, and that's just one of the drawbacks of the 1180 family. Also, it has a relatively short power reserve. I think we're becoming increasingly accustomed in an era when Rolex's standard is becoming 70 hours. A 21.6 beat rate and a 40-hour power reserve on the 1180 family, I think.
Yeah.
It's time for a second generation of that
If
movement.
we're talking about the 1185, we do have to talk about the Omega 3300 series too,
Yes,
as
please.
well, because you have the 3300 series, which even though they don't like to say it came from that, it did. It was based on that. It is made a little larger. And then they actually did the 3313s are actually the coaxial version of it, and they have A, B, C. I think they have the D or E with it now.
And they have stabilized them and made them reliable over the year. Like the 2500s, through several alphabetical iterations, they have stabilized the escapement, they have stabilized the watch, they've made them tougher, they've changed the beat rate to the now coaxial distinctive 25-2. But yeah, the Frederic Piguet was kind of a first generation modern day luxury watch movement. It's getting a little small, it is a little bit delicate, not well suited to display casebacks because of its size, not its finish, and the power reserve and non-hacking functionality mean that it is time for an update.
Right.
Now, the Valjoux 7750, the Beast, 1971 to present. I've got one on the table somewhere here. I know I've got...
And it's a love-hate situation with that.
And so is the watch it's in. It's an Hublot Big Bang Evo right there. The 7750, Mike, tell me all about the 7750.
It is. We talk about this on just about every show. It's a single directional wind. It does have some issues. It came out in the early 1970s. But the only thing it has over the El Primero is the hacking.
Yeah.
You know, that's the only thing it has, but it also has a much thicker profile to it. But it is a workhorse movement. It's powered so many watches. There are millions of them out there. Even the old ones still run. They're still producing them.
Yeah.
Everybody uses them. Whether you put a platform on, I've seen perpetual calendars on top of them. You know, they could put pretty much anything on top of the 7750. It's serviceable no matter what, and parts are available for it.
Yeah, anyone can service it. Parts are available everywhere. You have a huge selection. I mean, the back catalog
Finishes.
of 7750. You can go from the haute de gamme to the, trash can lid levels of finishing with this. And there are endless possibilities. Remember, the IWC Destrero Scafusia was powered by a manual wind variant of the 7750. And that was all for the grand complication elements: repeater, tourbillon, split second, perpetual calendar in a single 7750 based movement. Again, it is thick. Mike, it's a cheeseburger, 7.9 millimeters thick.
Yeah, it's a workhorse. It was designed to be robust. It filled that. You know, it lived up to that reputation. It does have its drawbacks. It has reversing wheel or automatic problems with the ratchet drive wheel. They break. They've improved that. The latest versions for the last probably 15 years have been bronze wheels instead of brass. But it's always going to have calendar drive problems. If you go to do the quick set and you're between 10 and 2, you're pretty much going to break parts if the watch needs a service. And it's, again, we talked about this on different shows. That date drive wheel isn't the flaw. The flaw is in further up the train in the setting mechanism. There's actually a clutch there, and if that clutch locks up, that's when it breaks the date drive wheel.
And this can be deceptive during repairs,
service.
because a lot of times there will be continuous remediation of the wrong part of the system. Now, it's important to note that, and I'm going to grab my Journe Calibre 1506 Centigraphe here, the 7750 has the same problem the El Primero has with respect to casebacks with display and modern case sizes. At 30 millimeters, the 7750 is bigger than some, but it's still smaller than it needs to be for a lot of modern applications. You'll note on many dials that the registers of the 7750 appear to be shrunken together, almost like they're gravitationally being pulled toward the cannon pinion. The 7750, and there are several versions of it known as Valgrange calibers that just have expanded base plates. It's a little bit small for modern applications. I want to highlight the Journe because the Centigraphe, which is a 40 millimeter case, has a movement that is very nearly 34 millimeters in size. So Journe is demonstrating how you build a movement to fill a case, whereas with the 7750, a lot of times aesthetic gymnastics are performed and spacer rings installed to make that old movement fit a modern case.
And one of the things with that, with the larger movements, the A series of the movements, it also has a larger oscillating weight.
Yes.
Which also leads to more broken ratchet drive wheels.
By the A series, Mike means the Valgrange movements that have come out since 2009. Basically taking the old 7750 and just making it bigger.
Expanding it.
You'll know when you see it. Lots of perlage, machine applied. Okay.
Chopard uses them a lot.
A great caliber, a real modern classic in the making, the 2011 to present Omega 9300, being phased out since 2016 by the new 9900 Master Chronometer, Master Coaxial. But, I mean, advantages. Looked great for a machine-finished caliber. 55 to 60-hour power reserve, solidly more than the standard 42 in the industry. The coaxial that's both accurate and tough. Advanced material integration. They've made silicon work quite well.
SI14.
And it's also led to concrete benefits in that Omega has expanded its warranty on these watches. Full-featured column wheel and vertical clutch with wonderful little time zone functionality, jump in the hour hand.
Yeah, it has a jump hour hand. That's both for calendar corrector, they use it, and also for the for your GMT, or for your time zone.
Does it have any real disadvantages?
You know what? I love the movement. I love the Omega, the 8500 base.
Yes.
You know, and everything they made off of that. They're designed so well. Again, they went through growing pains when they came out, but obviously by having the 5-year warranty, they worked through them.
Yeah.
It's a very serviceable movement. All those movements are serviceable. The parts drop together. There's no fitting of parts. There's no lining up pinions or anything. The bridges just drop together on those watches. They're actually a pleasure to work on.
Now, I will say this, Mike. It's probably, I would say the disadvantages, we can get over machine finish, because in that price range it's acceptable.
Exactly.
I will say that it's complicated enough they're very highly jeweled calibers. They are modular in chronograph form, probably complicated enough to overwhelm an untrained serviceman.
Absolutely.
They require specialized training, and you've actually gone to that
training and tools, yes. Yeah, same thing. Without the right training and tools, you shouldn't be touching these watches. You know, even the 8500, because if anything goes wrong, you're not getting the parts for it.
Yeah, you're over 330 parts, 54 jewels. It's like the difference between a 4-cam Ferrari and an old Chevy small block. Maybe with the small block you can work on that thing in the shade of the tree in your yard, but believe me, the guy who's rebuilding a 4-cam 5-valve V12 from the 90s, that guy's got like a PhD in mechanical engineering, and it's the same thing with the 9300.
Yeah, the 9300, it will challenge you. You don't want anything to go wrong because it's going to get really expensive really fast.
Qualified service, though, about as good as a modern caliber comes.
Yeah.
Now, interesting one, because this is a little bit of something old and something new, and we've got an example of it on the table tonight, but the Ulysse Nardin caliber UN 150. Now, it's in-house, but it's not entirely UN. It's got a long history dating back to 1972. Tell me about
the
that.
Lamania. I think the first version I saw of that in Lamania was in a Sin, and a takeoff of that or a version of the Sin, and it was a strange movement the first time you work on it. With the ones that I worked on had the center minute recorder.
Yes.
And it had the little ice tongs that would come in and grab it, and every other version, this is the highest version that I've seen. And we've actually done a service on this one here. And it has the silicone escape wheel and a silicone pallet as well.
It's a really interesting watch because originally this was the Lamania 1340, doing business as the Omega Caliber 1040, and that was 1972. We have a picture of the original Lamania, just so you know how far this thing is divergent from the core genus, like the core DNA. It's gone from being a single-sided balance cock with a standard mobile index to being free-sprung with a full balance wheel. Like Mike said, they've added a silicon escapement, the escape wheel and the pallet, but also the hairspring, so it's amagnetic. A full balance bridge and free-sprung plus ceramic rotor bearings. The level of decoration is through the roof. They've changed the bridges, and in between its time with La Magna and Omega and its 2013 to present tenure with UN, it did business as a semi-in-house caliber by Abel. In which capacity it was the Abel, if you remember the 137, they did a lot of work on it in their own right, and they later transferred the tooling and even a couple of the watchmakers involved in production to UN when UN bought the rights to the movement. So this has come a long way, Mike. I mean, what are its disadvantages?
It's not a simple movement to work on. This is another movement that will challenge you. If you've never done one, you probably don't want to. They've challenged me, especially in the brigade version.
Yes.
With the single minute recorder, or the center minute recorder, they will challenge you. The calendar corrector, the way there's levers that you can't even see underneath the calendar bridges that just have to fall together. It's a very, very complex movement, but once it's together, once it's running, if you know the movement, it's not as bad. The first time you do it, though, it's going to drive you crazy.
So it's not universally serviceable.
No.
It's not the kind of thing you're going to take to your local watchmaker. It's a bit of an exotic. And what was originally considered germane to the type is a fairly low-end, well-built and tough, cam-operated and lateral yoke chronograph has become a little bit dated. The cam and the lateral yoke, it's the kind of thing that doesn't feel as crisp as it should for a high-end chronograph in the hand. It's precise, but I feel like this is yesterday's technology in today's movement, alongside a silicon escapement and hairspring.
Right. Like you said, they used old technology and they built it up as far as they can go. This movement, to me, can't be taken any further than it is in this execution. It's a beautiful execution, though. Don't get me wrong with that.
I will say, a lot of people ask me about this movement because they think there's some sort of malfunction. It has the grittiest date change. You actually feel like you're winding the watch while you're changing the date.
Yeah, it goes in a winding position when you're changing the date. And at the first time you feel it, you think something's wrong, you think something didn't disconnect. You go into position 2, you go to do your date set, and there's a lot of resistance because you're still in winding. And while we mention that, let's mention real quick on the El Primero.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Where El Primero did one thing where they switched positions. When you're winding the watch, you're in position 1. When you're setting the watch, you're actually in position 2, which would normally be your calendar quickset. You pull the crown out all the way, you're in calendar quickset. So people have a habit of always doing that. They go to set the watch and they're changing the calendar, not being able to find the time. So that's one little drawback with the El Primero.
I would also say this, you can do some damage to a watch by switching over the date accidentally during the changeover. And in the El Primero, when you pull the crown all the way out till it stops, in any other watch, now you'd be setting the time. In the El Primero, you've gone into quick set mode for the date. So you want to watch that. It's not a mechanical defect, it's just an odd design choice that will catch you unaware. So we've got, I guess you could say this is kind of, maybe it's emerging as the new standard, but the Rolex 4130. Now, of course, from 88 to 99, Zenith El Primero, highly modified, doing business as the much improved but lower beat Rolex 4030.
And they didn't make many of those, did they?
No. I mean,
the numbers are relatively low.
Exclusive, and I think that's part of the mystique of the Zenith era of the Daytona. Zenith was making its own watches, it was making calibers for other brands, and at the same time it was making a few for Rolex. So it's not even like Zenith's entire capacity of 40 to 50,000 movements was poured entirely into the Rolex. It was like a segment of a segment, and thus, whether you're looking at a white gold Zenith Daytona, a two-tone, a steel, each individual variant, especially the steel, is a smaller subset of an already small class of Daytona, and they're not making any more. And that actually rolls into one of the disadvantages of the 4130 that I'll get to in a moment, but let's talk about what it does so well. Since 2000, far less complex than the El Primero.
Yeah, it's actually a lot less complex. Although it started to get the technology finally caught up with it.
Yeah.
And they're going very high tech in the chronograph wheel, where it's not a gear anymore. It's a feathered wheel. and it's supposed to start. So when you start the chronograph, it's supposed to have a smoother capture to it.
It's like one of those. It's like one of those like Leica profile photo etched.
Exactly. And it's a photo etched wheel, and it just grabs so much easier, where it almost flexes into it instead of trying to grab a tooth.
Now, it's also worth mentioning other advantages. The El Primero never hacked. The 4130 does. The El Primero used a conventional lateral yoke, so you'll always see the chronograph jump before it settles into its cadence. That doesn't happen with the Rolex 4130.
Right.
And I guess other advantage is just a more stable balance because it's braced on both sides by a full bridge, not the cock of the El Primero. It's free sprung. Now, it's also a Breguet over coil with the parachrome blue alloy, so it's not amagnetic, but it has more anti-magnetism than the old El Primero.
Yes, exactly. Anti-magnetic.
And then I guess finally, power reserve. You like it, I like it. 72 hours versus 52, and really with no penalty. It doesn't come at the expense of complexity. They didn't have to add a second barrel. They didn't have to do anything that wasn't consistent with the goal of simplifying while adding capability. And of course, it's still a chronometer, so it's very accurate. Disadvantages, Mike, like we mentioned, it's just not exclusive compared to the old Zenith.
Exactly. It's different. Without parts, you're not going to be able to work on it. Parts and tooling.
And that's a problem, too, because a lot of the serviceability advantages were negated just in the last 2 years.
They pulled everybody.
Yeah, you can't take this to even a local Rolex authorized service center anymore.
Rolex pretty much pulled service on everybody on the 4130. Matter of fact, I don't know any watchmakers that have it, any independents or dealers right now that'll actually do 4130 service with the parts. So pretty much all the 4130s are going back to Rolex until Rolex comes up with a training program where they're ready to certify the watchmakers.
So at this point, the mothership is your only solution for servicing this caliber. So though simpler, it's not necessarily easier to get it serviced. It's actually going to require a trip back to your regional Rolex corporate service center. A local authorized service center, even with a parts account, can't do the 4130 anymore.
Right, and the one thing that I will say about that, though, even though you're sending it back to Rolex, the price is not astronomical. You're going to pay about the same price if you send it to a local. The only difference is going to be your time frame.
That's true.
And your service time.
They do keep it real on that front.
Yeah.
It's not exorbitant. Now, I will say this. An interesting movement that we've got on the table and on your wrist tonight.
No, that's not a 94, though.
That's a DD?
That's a DD.
That's a DD,
yeah.
okay. I've got the real thing right here. The 94 and the 2892 with the DD are both 2892 based modular chronograph calibers, automatic. I've got one of the little Schumacher reduceds right here, and this is a 94. 2894 since about 95, 96. It's ETA's in-house version of what others were doing with the 2892 and a Dubois de Praz module. What's good about this movement, Mike?
It has less parts. That's the one thing. There's less parts in the movement. It's a nightmare to service, though. Yeah. And for the longest time,
straight to the drawbacks.
Omega even said that you cannot service it. If you go on ETA's website, this is non-serviceable. I was able to get service training through Omega through actually Lange's for this, because they use it and they service it still. And so the parts are available. Service is available if you have the right tooling. It's a very simple movement to put together. Again, there's not a lot of parts, not a lot of moving parts. The finish on it is not pretty. It's not a pretty movement. There's weld spots on stuff, spot welds all over it. It's a utility movement.
It's a utility movement built by robots.
Yes, exactly.
So here's the thing, guys. Looking at the back of it, it looks exactly like a 2892, which is to say there's very little to see. It is reliable and tough. It fits in cases that can accommodate a 2892. So from a watchmaking perspective, if you're a brand, you can drop it into anything that'll fit a 2892. It's still fairly thin, considering its complexity, the module on top of a base, and it does have the hacking and in certain applications the quick set, so you still get a lot of functionality. It does require a specially trained watchmaker. It does require a special movement holder. As Mike alluded, it has the dial side from hell, both ugly and difficult to work on without the right tools, and with a 38 to 40 hour power reserve, it has very short autonomy. It's complicated for what it is, maybe. What it accomplishes is not that much more than a 7750.
Exactly. We talk about the comparison. I think is closer to the DD modules. You have twice as many parts in the DD modules, but they're so, to me, they're so easy to service. I could throw one together literally in 30 minutes. Just the module itself, the adjustments, everything done. That's not dialing it or anything. It's just putting the parts together because it makes sense. That watch, it's a little different.
And now there are some interesting movements that we've got on the table tonight that you're not going to see as often. I tried to take the movements that you see in large groups of watches on the mass market, but we do have some exemplars that are exceptional. The 1506 in the Centigraphe, the L951-1 in the Dato. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these. Now, it's important to note that the Lange L951-1 was very much of the modern era. Raf's got a great picture of it for you. Relative to the El Primero, which can be executed at the same level of finish. That's the thing. The Lange comes in one level of finish. The El Primero, at different price points, from $6,000 up to hundreds of thousands.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you can get an El Primero finished to this level. The main differences are going to be you'll never have an El Primero that's manually wound and finished to the standard of this L951. You can't have both. There is a Calibre 420 manual El Primero out in the world. It doesn't look like this.
That is an absolutely stunning movement. It just, the finish, the anglage, everything on that movement is stunning.
And it is a new generation of movement designed to be seen, and that's another disadvantage of the El Primero. Right. The winding bridge, the automatic system, the rotor, you're always going to be looking at a masked movement regardless of the level of finish, and that's the nature of an automatic. So the Dato, if you can get past the finish, its inherent advantage is that it is just more visible. It has more depth to it. It uses a different material that you'll never see. You'll never see...
just the color of the finish.
The golden honey-colored miquart or German silver of the movement. It's finished to a different sensibility and standard, and it comes from a different finishing tradition. To a large extent, this is what modern Saxon watchmaking looks like at the highest level. The Zenith is built in a standard that is redolent of Swiss rhodium-plated brass. La Loque, a tradition that is different than Glasuta and Lange. I will say this, the El Primero has some advantages. In terms of autonomy, that first generation Datograph from 1999 to 2011 is a 36-hour power reserve. So you're going to be winding it daily. A pleasure, but you're going to be winding it daily.
The one drawback I don't like about the Datograph is where they put the calendar corrector. That's one thing that's always troubled me with the Lange. And everything else, the function on the watch, everything else is perfect. The feel of everything is flawless. But the calendar corrector has always been one thing that's perplexed me.
Also worth mentioning, it is a hacking movement, the El Primero isn't, and it does come with standard flyback functionality. So while you can get almost any function in an El Primero, there are, I don't want to say millions, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens of variants up to the level of grand complication. The Dato and its tourbillon perpetual calendar counterparts in the Lange catalog and the Lange Chronograph catalog, they don't perhaps offer as many options, but each individual execution is going to be exceptional, whereas the El Primero has a span that's very price dependent. Now, another interesting movement that I've got here, a lot of folks are wondering about IWC and their 89 360 family. This is the 89. Well, it's got a mono counter with the hours and the minutes, so the 89 361, the 365 is just minutes. Now, this is a movement that debuted in the mid to late 2000s, I want to say about 2007, integrating IWC's Peloton winding system with 4 pawls rather than 2. Very efficient, 68-hour power reserve. Like the Lange, it has flyback functionality. Mike, you've been inside some of these movements. What do you think are their strengths and weaknesses?
For whatever it is, they seem to get dirty. They produce dirt, and I think it has to do with the Peloton winding system. And now they're going with the ceramic parts on there. So I want to see if the new ceramic parts in the Peloton are actually going to reduce that. But a lot of times you'll see these watches, they're not that old. If they've been worn a lot or lived on a winder, there will be dirt on the rotor, and what that dirt is metal shavings.
Yeah. Metal shavings, sedimentation, debris, all the terms watchmakers use to describe movements that basically shed. Yeah. And I've noticed this exact same phenomenon. This one's clean right here, but I've seen many examples where the thing has never been opened, it's relatively new, and like you said, sediments are visible.
The sediments are visible on top of the rotor, on top of the movement, so it gets everywhere. So it's almost like it sprays. Whether or not these are winder queen watches, I don't know. I don't know if people are wearing these watches or if they, like I said, they're just being constantly wound, which is something that I just don't go for. We've talked about that before. I don't like keeping watches on a winder unless you have a complex calendar that you have to reset, because you're putting so much strain on those automatic components to keep that watch fully wound. Something's going to give somewhere. Something's going to wear out, and that watch is going to need a service more than a watch that you let just relax and pick it up every once in a while and wind it than to be able to wear it.
And again, because this has 4 individual pawls rather than the more common 2, there's just that much more opportunity to start sedimentation of the movement. That is one of the reasons IWC moved to a full ceramic pawl and pawl wheel system for the new series of 50,000s. If you look at the 52,000s, black ceramic pawls, black ceramic pawl wheels. Otherwise, it's a very thick movement at 7.5 millimeters. It's getting close to the 7750.
It's a big movement. It's all around a big movement. Again, servicing them, I've done a couple of them. It's nothing I'm really comfortable with. So because of parts, they use so many different screws in the movement. It is a very complex movement, especially when you get into the power reserve, everything else. It just gets. It's a difficult movement to service.
And that's important to know. The number of different types of screws in a movement, it's like inversely proportional to how much the watchmaker likes it. Like when they went from the Rolex 4030 to the 4130, they dramatically decreased not just the number of parts, but the number of distinct types of screw in the movement. The IWC's
got a lot of screws. A lot of different screws.
The IWC is thick. It's complicated. It's not something your local watchmaker can work on. It does have a tendency to sediment, but to its credit, vertical clutch and a column wheel, built-in flyback functionality, standard, hacking, quick set. It is tough. It is a tough movement.
Very tough. Very tough.
And a 68-hour power reserve, which again is getting up to where we think really the standard should be of around 70 hours today in a luxury watch. It's also a good-looking automatic, which is not a given. There are a lot of automatic chronos, 2894, I'm looking at you, that are just ugly. There's nothing to see. The IWC is a good-looking, tough, high-tech movement. Again, IWC understands that there's a need for improvement, and through the years, it has made those improvements.
Well, they made the improvements, too, in the beat in that watch.
The 50,000s they did. This, I want to say, this guy was born at 4 hertz and is still at 4 hertz. But IWC, in its big pilot style calibers, has increased the beat rate from 18,000 now to 28.8. So definitely on point there, and I guess we should finish up with one of the all-timers, the CH27 slash Lemania 1873. It evolved from the CH27 and the Calibre 321.
CH27, which is still being produced, and we talk about this. We would love to see it, be revised in an Omega, and just love to see it come back. Patek used it up until recently.
Yes.
Vacheron still uses it. Roger Dubuis. It's a beautiful movement. The CH27, it's a low beat. It's an 18,000 low beat movement, which it's going to give you a steppier chronograph. The chrono hand itself, it's going to step more. You're actually going to see it, but it's a sweet movement to work on. And column wheel.
Exactly.
And that's where
this came from.
Yep, that's where this came from without the column wheel.
Exactly. We've got the 1861 right here. I think I've got a picture of the 1863 with the display case back finish. There are 2 different versions. One looks better for the sapphire sandwich. But the basic Moonwatch and its Calibre 1861 comes from the same era as the El Primero. The 861 debuted in 1968. The El Primero previewed in 69, on the market by 70. The main difference between the two of them, if you can get past the beat rate, this is 2160, El Primero is 36,000. If you can get past the fact that this has no date, the El Primero generally does. If you can get past the fact that the El Primero is an automatic, it all comes down to the cam-operated chronograph and toughness. And this 18-jewel monster is almost unkillable.
It's a beautiful movement to service. I love the vintage ones to the modern ones. They're all predictable. Even the low beats vintage ones, the 861s. They're so nice to work on. Parts are available. They just had a change in I want to say in the hairsprings and the hairspring studs. They just did an upgrade on that. I was reading it actually last week. So, new parts, old parts are still being supplied, but there's new versions of it. And you could probably show this real quick too, if we pull up the difference in the chrono hands between, if you start that one, we put them next to each other, and the El Primero, just to give you an idea. When we talk about the actual beats, the 36,000, or the 19, it's just, you could see the difference in the chronograph hands.
Yeah, let me see if I can set up my race horses here. This guy's beating away. Okay, good. There we go.
This is the difference we talk about when you see a movement. We say it's the high beat or low beat. You actually see it in the chronograph hand.
Yeah, so it is, you're looking at the Omega, which is 3 hertz, 21,600 vibrations per hour, and the El Primero, which is 36,000 vibrations per hour, 5 hertz. And you can actually see the difference in the smoothness of their sweep. Again, the 1861 that's still used by NASA was retained and is maintained because it is so tough. There are movements with longer power reserves. Obviously, it's not a high horology movement, even though it is very distantly related to the CH27 that you'll find in Patek Philippe's, like the 5070. But if you wanted to compare these two, you would say they served entirely different purposes. Yeah. Their common thread is that they hail from the same era, and they've both enjoyed shocking longevity.
Absolutely, absolutely, and they're both fantastic movements. I love servicing the 1861s. I just when they come across my bench, I'm happy to see them. They're fun to do.
So, guys, thanks for joining us tonight. I want to give a special shout out to my man Federico, who was talking watches live in the chat box all night. You can also check us out on Instagram, where he is talking watches 24 hours a day. And of course, if you want a shorter segment, Watch You Want Watch Reviews, my new YouTube channel, where you can see me reviewing everything in the Watch You Want inventory 24 hours a day. Now, Mike, thank you for joining us today.
Tim, it was great to be back.
Honestly, I couldn't have said it better myself, so I want to thank Alfred, I want to thank Jesse, I want to thank Raph, I want to thank Federico, and I want to thank Mike. I'm Tim, this is Watch You Want. Thanks to all of you, and thanks for logging on.